I have played around with making games for a few years now, but I had only finished a few small, horrible game jam games, so I decided to work on a big project, starting it during this period of my life when I am fortunate enough to be able to invest a large portion of time into it every day. I decided to develop a game from an idea that has been cooking around in my mind for a few years. It's a 3D Metroidvania game that has a dynamic world that you can explore and interact with in different ways. You play as a humanoid robot, deep in the ruins of a city in a post-apocalyptic world. A big part of the gameplay being platforming, with items that you find hidden in the world unlocking different ways to traverse the environment. You should be able to talk with a lot of the people and creatures that you find. And you can complete the game as a pacifist if you want to. But the combat will also be pretty fun, with a few different weapons, each offering a unique gameplay style. Of course, this is a big project to be completed by just one person, so I am willing to sacrifice a few features here and there. I am making the game in Unreal Engine 4, because it is really powerful, with a lot of built-in features and functionality. The only downside for me is that the documentation can be a little lackluster. So you have to constantly dig into and experiment with different functions to understand how they work, but it's very worth it. I started with trying to add grappling hook mechanics, because movement will be a big part of the game. I first made one that just pulled you. Then I tried making one that functioned like a rope. It was fun doing that, but it had a lot of bugs, and I thought that it would be better to start off with something more substantial. After all, I still wasn't sure about how I wanted the grappling hook to function, given that I didn't know how combat and exploration would work, so I put that feature on hold and moved on to other things. I then went on to blocking out the starting area, adding an interaction system with a document that you can read, and creating the base for the NPCs and the dialogue system. I spent a while experimenting with different ways to do the dialogue, and when I had something that worked well enough, I started to develop the weapons. I first made a bomb, and then I started to work on a crossbow. The physics weren't behaving properly at first, and I had some trouble with getting the bolts to function properly, but after tweaking things I managed to get them working. The crossbow took some work to snap to your hand and back with the right rotation, and I still didn't have a model for it, so I made it using simple shapes and textures built into the engine. After doing all this programming, I felt like the game was a little lifeless, so I went on to model the main character. That took a lot longer than what I expected, mainly because I used Blender, which I am new to, coming from Maya. But most of what I knew about 3D translated pretty well into Blender. I mostly just had to learn the names of the tools and how to use the interface. I had to make the character using a bunch of different parts, and as it was the first game asset that I made, I figured out the art style as I modeled him, settling with something a bit low poly. I was a little worried that the head would look weird and creepy, and that it would be difficult to make, but I actually did it fairly quickly, with only the teeth being troublesome to do. I think he looks pretty good and even a little cute for some reason. After a week and a lot of trouble with rigging, I had modeled and animated the character, which was ready to be imported into the engine. The character and the animations produced some funny results at first, and took quite a lot of work to be implemented in Unreal in the way that I wanted them to. But just by being there, the character made the project feel much more exciting. After playing around with some ideas and doing the logic for when each animation should be played, the movement system was complete. Because movement felt natural when you stopped running, I made it so the character played stop animations when stopping suddenly. But at the end they just didn't look good, so I scrapped them for now. I wanted to see more of the game coming to life, so I created the gnomes, which took just one day to make, much less than I expected it to take. Probably because I was getting the hang of Blender, and because gnomes don't really have a lot of moving parts. The difficult part, actually, came when importing them into Unreal, because you have to export them with very specific settings for things to work properly, and I didn't export in the way that you're supposed to, so the gnomes produced creepy, inexplicable results when inside the engine. Although after some tweaking I got things to work without having to redo too much work. Then came the fun part. The gnomes could now chase me. I could take damage and die. The frustrating thing is that I still didn't have a reliable way to kill them in turn. I could only use bombs. To spice things up a little, I modeled the meshes for the cave environment, but I will remake most of them later, as it was quite apparent that the environment was made with tiles, and I couldn't just scale things up because they would just lose quality. I then got excited and spent a whole day just messing around with lighting, shaders, and adding particles for the campfire. After that, I quickly added a bunch of features. You could now collect scrap metal to heal yourself, sprint, jumping was more polished, sparks would come out of you when you took damage, and the gnomes became smarter. When it came to the physics for the character, I realized that he had the same problem as the gnomes, so I had to redo a few of his animations and make tweaks to his model. Eventually I figured that it was time to return to the basics and started to polish the crossbow. I started with modeling it, then I made animations, added a strap to the character, and then it was time to program a bunch of little features that would make a crossbow work properly. From rotating the character according to where you are aiming, to spawning bolts in the quiver when you take them, removing the bolts when you shoot them. The gnomes could finally be killed. So I had some fun with it and added sound effects, made by my own voice. It sounds really cringy and I will edit most of it, but for now it's serviceable. I also expanded the blocked out environment, planning out how we will progress through the game, adding in some platforming and placing some items around. Lastly, I added blood effects, so now you can indulge yourself in the gnome slaying blood fast. It has been really fulfilling to work on this project, and I am excited to see how it will progress and come to life as I work on it.